The crack of a gunshot echoed across the plains of Wyoming Territory as Killian Iron lowered his smoking revolver, watching the wolf that had been stalking his cattle crumple to the ground. Spring of 1873 had brought more predators than usual, making survival in these parts even harder for a man who'd already lost everything once before. The hard lines etched into Killian's weather-beaten face told a story of loss and hardship. At 32, he'd built his modest ranch from nothing after the war took his family back in Tennessee. The locals called him the Ghost not because he was feared dead, but because he barely existed beyond the necessities of survival. He spoke little, smiled never, and kept to himself save for monthly supply runs to the growing settlement of Cottonwood Springs. Killian holstered his Colt and whistled for his horse, a sturdy Appaloosa named Savage. The irony wasn't lost on him, the horse had a gentler temperament than its owner. The small herd of cattle grazed peacefully now that the threat was eliminated. His ranch wasn't much, but it was his, and protecting it was all that mattered. The next morning, Killian rode into Cottonwood Springs with a list of supplies needed and wolf pelts to trade. The town had grown considerably in the 3 years since he'd staked his claim 15 miles out. New establishments lined the muddy Main Street, including a 2-story hotel that hadn't been there during his last visit. "Mr. Iron," greeted Samuel Walsh, the bearded proprietor of the general store. "Been a spell. Thought maybe the winter took you." "Takes more than cold to kill me," Killian replied, his voice rough from disuse. He placed his list on the counter. "Need these today." "Might take some time to gather it all. Town's buzzing with newcomers since the railway announcement." Walsh began collecting items from shelves. "Got yourself some competition too. New ranchers settling north of your place." Killian's jaw tightened. More people meant more trouble. "Don't need neighbors," Walsh chuckled. "World's changing, Iron, railroads coming through next year, won't be able to stay a ghost forever." Killian ignored the comment. "What'll you give me for these?" He placed 3 wolf pelts on the counter. While Walsh examined the pelts, the bell above the door jingled. Killian didn't turn, focused on his transaction until a sound he rarely heard in these parts caught his attention: feminine laughter, light and melodic like water over smooth stones. Despite himself, he glanced over his shoulder. A young woman he'd never seen before stood just inside the doorway, shaking raindrops from her bonnet. He hadn't even noticed the spring shower that had begun outside. She was accompanied by an older woman, presumably her mother, both dressed in traveling clothes that, while not extravagant, were finer than what most local women wore. "Mrs. Preston, Miss Preston?" Walsh called out cheerfully. "Your order's ready in the back." "Just finishing up with Mr. Iron here." The younger woman, Miss Preston, smiled politely in Killian's direction. He quickly turned away, uncomfortable with both the acknowledgement and his own unexpected interest. "Thank you, Mr. Walsh," she replied. Her voice carried a hint of an Eastern accent. "We're in no hurry." Walsh lowered his voice. $20 for the pelts, and I'll throw in that coffee you like. These are the Preston ladies. Widow Preston bought Old Man Henderson's place. Her daughter's opening a schoolhouse come fall. A schoolteacher. Killian grunted in response and nodded at the deal, keeping his back to the newcomers. He needed his supplies and needed to be gone. Towns made him uneasy, and women like Miss Preston, educated, refined, reminded him of how far removed he was from civilized society. Walsh disappeared to the back room to gather Killian's supplies, leaving an awkward silence. Killian kept his eyes fixed on a rack of tools, willing the man to hurry. "Excuse me," came that same voice, closer now. "Mr. Iron, is it?" Killian turned slowly, finding Miss Preston standing a respectable distance away. Up close, he could see her eyes were a clear hazel, her complexion fair but with a dusting of freckles that suggested she wasn't afraid of the sun. She was younger than he'd first thought, perhaps 23 or 24. "Yes," he answered simply, resisting the urge to adjust his worn hat or brush the dust from his coat. "Lydia Preston," she introduced herself with a slight nod. "I understand your ranch borders our new property to the south." "Might do," he replied, uncomfortable with the direct way she looked at him, as if she were assessing more than just his words. "Mother and I were hoping to meet our neighbors. Perhaps you could join us for supper sometime." The invitation was delivered with such casual warmth that Killian momentarily forgot to refuse. "Don't socialize," he finally managed, his tone harsher than intended. Rather than appearing offended, a small smile played at her lips. "Everyone has to eat, Mr. Iron, even ghosts." The reference to his local nickname startled him. She must have been asking about him. Before he could respond, Walsh returned with his supplies, and Killian seized the opportunity to conclude his business. He paid, gathered his goods, and nodded curtly to both Walsh and the Preston women before making his escape. As he loaded his supplies onto Savage, the rain continued to fall, but Killian barely noticed. His thoughts were preoccupied with hazel eyes and a laugh that somehow made his chest feel tight. 2 weeks passed before Killian encountered Lydia Preston again. He'd been tracking a mountain lion that had killed one of his calves, following its trail north dangerously close to the Preston property. The land that had belonged to old Henderson was decent enough, with a natural spring and good grazing, but the house had fallen into disrepair after the old man died. Killian wondered how 2 women from back east were managing it. His question was answered when he crested a hill and saw the homestead below. The roof had been repaired, and a fresh coat of whitewash brightened the exterior. A modest garden had been started, and a corral now housed several horses. Most surprising was the sight of Lydia Preston herself, axe in hand, attempting to split firewood. Killian observed from a distance as she positioned a log, raised the axe with determination, and brought it down. The blade glanced off at an angle, barely making a dent. She tried again with similar results, her frustration evident even from where he sat on horseback. The practical part of him said to ride on the mountain lion was his concern, not this woman's firewood. But something about her stubborn persistence as she prepared for another swing compelled him forward. "You're gripping too high," he called out, startling her so badly she nearly dropped the axe. "Mr. Iron," Lydia pressed a hand to her chest, catching her breath, "you appear like a spirit." Killian dismounted, tethering Savage to a nearby post. "Your stance is wrong too, you'll hurt yourself." Lydia straightened, pushing a loose strand of auburn hair from her forehead. "Well, since you're here offering critiques, perhaps you'd care to demonstrate the proper technique." There was that hint of amusement in her voice again, challenging rather than deferring to him. Killian hesitated, then stepped forward and held out his hand for the axe. "Our man of all work left us yesterday," she explained as she relinquished the tool. "Said 2 women alone weren't worth the trouble, mothers in town trying to find a replacement." Killian positioned a log on the chopping block. "Hold it like this," he demonstrated, "and let the weight of the axe do the work." With one clean stroke, he split the log neatly in 2. "Impressive," Lydia commented, taking back the axe when he offered it. She mimicked his stance, adjusted her grip as instructed, and brought the axe down. This time the log split, though not as cleanly as his had. Nevertheless, she grinned with triumph. "I did it." Her smile transformed her face, crinkling the corners of her eyes, and Killian found himself staring longer than was proper. He cleared his throat and looked away. "There's a mountain lion in these parts, killed one of my calves, might come for your livestock." "Oh," Lydia's expression sobered. "Thank you for the warning. We have chickens and 2 milk cows besides the horses." An awkward silence fell between them. Killian knew he should leave, continue tracking the predator, but found himself reluctant to go. "Would you like some coffee?" Lydia asked suddenly. "It's the least I can offer for the firewood lesson." Every instinct told Killian to refuse, to maintain the isolation that had protected him for years. Yet he heard himself say coffee would be fine. The inside of the Preston home was modest, but already showed signs of feminine touches: curtains at the windows, a braided rug on the floor, wildflowers in a mason jar on the table. Killian felt oversized and out of place as he removed his hat and sat at Lydia's invitation. "The house is coming along," she remarked as she stoked the stove and put a pot of coffee on to heat, "though there's still much to do before winter." "Why here?" The question left his mouth before he could stop it. Lydia turned, seemed to consider whether to take offense at his bluntness. "My father died last year," she finally said. Left debts we couldn't pay in Philadelphia. Mother has a brother in Cheyenne who told us land was cheap out here. We sold everything and came west. She poured coffee into two mismatched cups. Your turn, Mr. Iron. How did you come to be the ghost of Cottonwood Springs? Killian accepted the coffee but not the invitation to share his past. Been here 3 years. That's all there is to it. I very much doubt that's all there is to Killian Iron, she replied, sitting across from him. She didn't press further, though, instead asking about the mountain lion and what precautions they should take. He found himself explaining more than he'd intended about predator signs to watch for, how to secure livestock, and the importance of never venturing out unarmed. Lydia listened attentively, asking intelligent questions that suggested she was taking his advice seriously. When he finally stood to leave, having finished his coffee, Lydia walked him to the door. The supper invitation still stands, Mr. Iron. Mother makes an excellent rabbit stew. Killian settled his hat back on his head. I'll find that mountain lion, let you know when it's safe. I'll take that as a perhaps someday, she replied with that same smile that seemed to see right through him. On the ride home, Killian found himself replaying their conversation, the way she'd laughed when successfully splitting the log, how she'd challenged his reticence without pushing too hard. It had been a long time since he'd spoken to anyone for more than a few necessary exchanges, longer still since that someone had been a woman. Unwelcome memories surfaced of the wife and infant son he'd lost to fever while he was fighting a war he'd never believed in, of returning home to Tennessee to find nothing left for him. The years of drifting westward, taking what work he could find, until he'd saved enough to claim land of his own. The solitude had been his choice, his protection against feeling that kind of loss again. Yet something about Lydia Preston's laughter threatened the walls he'd built, and that made her more dangerous than any mountain lion. It took Killian 3 days to track and kill the predator. When he arrived at the Preston homestead with the carcass slung over his horse, he found both women in the yard, Lydia teaching her mother the proper way to split wood. The older woman looked up first, her expression shifting from surprise to alarm at the sight of the dead animal. Ladies, Killian greeted, tipping his hat, won't be bothering your livestock now. Mr. Iron, the older woman replied stiffly. How resourceful of you, Lydia approached, her eyes wide as she examined the mountain lion. It's enormous. Did you track it all this way yourself? Followed it to its den about 5 miles north, he confirmed, oddly pleased by her interest rather than revulsion. Mother, this is Mr. Killian Iron, our neighbor to the south, Lydia introduced. Mr. Iron, my mother, Lydia Preston. Killian nodded respectfully. Madam. Mr. Iron has been kind enough to warn us about the predator and show me how to properly chop wood, Lydia explained, a hint of mischief in her voice as she added, he's not nearly as ghost-like as the townspeople suggest. Lydia Preston's posture softened slightly. Then we owe you our gratitude, Mr. Iron. Would you join us for supper this evening? I believe I promised you rabbit stew. Trapped by courtesy and Lydia's expectant gaze, Killian found himself accepting. He departed to skin and dress the mountain lion, promising to return at sundown. As he rode away, he heard Lydia's laughter behind him, clear and bright in the afternoon sun, and realized with dismay that he was already looking forward to hearing it again. Supper at the Preston home was unlike any meal Killian had experienced in years. The table was set with actual china, the food served in courses rather than all at once, and conversation flowed continuously throughout. Lydia Preston, though initially reserved, proved to be an educated woman with decided opinions on everything from politics to literature. Lydia was quieter than he'd expected, observing the interaction between her mother and their guest with evident interest. Miss Preston tells me you've been established here 3 years, Lydia remarked as she served apple pie for dessert. That must have been before the worst of the troubles with the Sioux. Yes, madam, Killian confirmed. Though there's been peace since the treaty, most conflicts now are with outlaws, not Indians. And you manage your ranch entirely alone, no hands or family to assist you. Mother, Lydia interjected gently. It's a fair question, Lydia defended. If we're to be neighbors, we should know something of each other. Killian set down his fork. No family, lost them in '65, been on my own since. A heavy silence fell. Alina looked genuinely regretful. I apologize for prying, Mr. Iron. The war took many good men and left many broken ones, he replied quietly, then immediately regretted the uncharacteristic candor. We've all experienced loss, Lydia said, her voice soft but steady. Perhaps that's why this untamed country calls to us. A chance to build something new. Killian found himself looking at her, really looking, and saw an understanding in her eyes that surprised him. This wasn't just a schoolteacher playing at frontier life. There was a genuine resilience beneath her proper exterior. After supper, Alina excused herself with a headache, leaving Lydia to see their guest out. On the porch, the night air was cool and filled with the sounds of crickets and distant coyotes. Thank you for coming, Lydia said, standing beside him. Mother doesn't often have the opportunity for intellectual conversation. Don't know that I provided much of that, Killian replied wryly. Lydia laughed, the sound wrapping around him in the darkness. You underestimate yourself, Mr. Iron. You're an educated man, however much you try to hide it. The observation was too accurate for comfort. Killian had indeed been educated, the son of a Tennessee lawyer who'd expected his boy to follow in his footsteps before the war changed everything. The schoolhouse, he said, changing the subject. When will it open? September, if all goes well. We've had 12 children registered already. Her enthusiasm was evident. Will you help with the raising? The town council has agreed to provide materials, but we need men to build. The request caught him off guard. Not much for community affairs. No, you're not much for anything that might make you part of something, are you? The question held no judgment, merely curiosity. What are you afraid of, Mr. Iron? The directness of her query left him momentarily speechless. Women in his experience didn't speak so boldly, especially to men they barely knew. Not afraid, he finally said, just prefer my own company. I don't believe you, Lydia replied simply, but I won't press you further tonight. Will you come again, perhaps Sunday after church? Mother would enjoy it. Just your mother. The words slipped out before he could stop them. In the silver moonlight, he saw her smile. I suppose I might find your company tolerable as well, Mr. Iron. Against his better judgment, Killian found himself agreeing to return. Over the following weeks, Sunday suppers at the Preston home became a routine that Killian both anticipated and dreaded. Each visit chipped away at the protective isolation he'd maintained for so long. He began finding reasons to ride by their property, to check their fences, to bring fresh game, to help with repairs that were beyond the women's strength. Lydia Preston clearly had reservations about her daughter's growing friendship with the solitary rancher, but she was practical enough to recognize the value of his assistance. For his part, Killian maintained a careful distance from Lydia, even as he found himself increasingly drawn to her. By midsummer, the schoolhouse construction was underway in town. True to his word, Killian participated, working alongside men he'd previously avoided for years. The change in his demeanor didn't go unnoticed. Never thought I'd see the ghost swinging a hammer with the rest of us, remarked Thomas Wyatt, the blacksmith, during a water break. Those Preston ladies must have some powerful magic. Killian ignored the comment but couldn't deny the truth behind it. Something had shifted in him, and he wasn't entirely comfortable with the change. One August afternoon, while helping Lydia paint the newly constructed schoolhouse, he found himself speaking more freely than he had in years, telling her about the books he'd read as a young man, the law studies his father had insisted upon, even bits about his time in the war. Lydia listened attentively, occasionally asking questions but never pushing when he fell silent. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the schoolhouse windows, she set down her paintbrush and turned to him. "Why did you really help us with the mountain lion that day?" she asked. "You could have simply continued tracking it without stopping to teach me about firewood." Killian considered the question, choosing his words carefully. "Seemed wrong to let you struggle when I knew better. Is that the only reason?" He looked at her then, at the freckles across her nose that had multiplied in the summer sun, at the wisp of auburn hair that had escaped her practical bun, at the paint smudge on her cheek that she hadn't noticed. The truth rose within him, undeniable. Your laugh, he admitted quietly. Heard it in the store that first day, made me curious. A blush crept across Lydia's cheeks, but she held his gaze. Curiosity seems a thin reason to upend one's entire existence. Didn't realize that's what I was doing, he replied honestly. And now that you do. Her question hung in the air between them, laden with meaning. Before he could answer, voices outside announced the arrival of other volunteers. The moment passed, but something fundamental had changed. Killian had acknowledged, if only to himself, that Lydia Preston had become important to him in ways he hadn't allowed anyone to be in nearly a decade. The schoolhouse opening in September was a community celebration. Children and parents filled the modest building, admiring the fresh paint and new desks. Lydia, dressed in her finest blue dress, moved among them with natural grace, her face alight with joy as she welcomed each family. Killian stood apart, watching from near the doorway, painfully aware of the gulf between Lydia's world and his own. She belonged here among people, nurturing minds and building community. He had deliberately chosen isolation, turning his back on such connections after losing everything once before. She's quite remarkable, isn't she? Lydia Preston's voice startled him from his thoughts. The older woman had appeared beside him, her gaze fixed on her daughter. Yes, madam, Killian agreed simply. When my husband died, Lydia continued, her voice low enough that only he could hear, I thought I would die too. The pain was unbearable. I understand the impulse to withdraw, Mr. Iron. He glanced at her, surprised by the personal revelation. But Lydia wouldn't let me, she went on. She insisted that life continued, that we had to continue with it. Her strength saved me. Lydia turned to look directly at him. Perhaps she could save you too if you'd allow it. Before Killian could respond, Lydia moved away to join a group of town matrons, leaving him with thoughts he'd been avoiding for months. That evening, after the celebrations had concluded and the Preston women had returned home, Killian rode out alone to the ridge overlooking his ranch. The autumn air was crisp, stars brilliant overhead. His land spread below, the cabin and barns he'd built with his own hands, the cattle grazing peacefully in moonlit pastures. It was everything he'd worked for: independence, security, solitude. Yet for the first time since staking his claim, it felt incomplete. The sound of approaching hoofbeats drew his attention. Turning, he was surprised to see Lydia riding toward him, her figure unmistakable even in the dim light. Miss Preston, he greeted as she drew her horse alongside his. Riding alone at night isn't safe. Then it's fortunate I found you, isn't it? She replied, dismounting gracefully. I saw you heading this way after the celebration. I wanted to thank you for coming today. It meant a great deal to me. Killian remained on horseback, maintaining the physical distance that mirrored his emotional reserve. Schoolhouse wouldn't be standing without your determination. Town needed it. And what do you need, Killian? She used his given name for the first time, the intimacy of it hanging in the night air between them. He stared down at her, this woman who had somehow slipped past every defense he'd constructed. Shouldn't be out here alone with me. People will talk. Let them, Lydia said with surprising vehemence. I'm tired of watching you hold yourself apart. For months, I've seen glimpses of the man beneath the ghost, a man of principle and intelligence, of surprising gentleness and devastating pain. She stepped closer to his horse. Will you at least look at me properly when you reject me? The challenge in her words compelled him to dismount, though he maintained a cautious distance. Not rejecting you, he said roughly. Protecting you from what? Your fearsome reputation, the terrible risk of caring for someone. Lydia's voice softened. Or are you protecting yourself from the possibility of loss again? Her perception cut too close to the bone. Lost everything once, he admitted. Don't survive that twice. You're not surviving now, Killian. You're merely existing. She moved toward him slowly, as one might approach a wild creature. I watch you when you don't realize, when a child says something amusing at supper, when the sunset paints the mountains gold, there's life in you still, wanting to break free. Lydia, he warned, but didn't retreat as she drew nearer. I'm not asking for promises, she continued. I'm asking you to stop punishing yourself for surviving when others didn't, to consider that perhaps happiness isn't a betrayal of those you've lost. When she was standing directly before him, close enough that he could smell the lavender in her hair, she reached up and gently touched his bearded cheek. "I've come to care for you, Killian Iron, very much. If you feel nothing in return, I'll accept that and trouble you no further. But if there's even a chance." The walls he'd maintained for so long crumbled at her touch. With a groan that sounded wrenched from the depths of his soul, Killian pulled her to him, his mouth finding hers in a kiss that spoke of years of loneliness and newfound hope. Lydia responded with equal fervor, her arms encircling his neck as though she'd never let him go. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, he rested his forehead against hers. "Been feeling things I didn't want to feel," he confessed. "Afraid of what it means, afraid of losing you too." "Oh, Killian," Lydia whispered, her fingers threading through his hair. "Life offers no guarantees, only possibilities. I choose to believe in the possibility of us." Under a canopy of stars, with the land he'd built stretching below them, Killian made the most difficult and most rewarding choice of his life to risk his heart again. Their courtship progressed with surprising swiftness once Killian stopped fighting his feelings. By Christmas, with Aliner's blessing, they were engaged to be married in the spring. The town that had known him only as the ghost gradually came to accept him as Killian Iron, rancher and future husband of their schoolteacher. The wedding took place in May of 1874, with wildflowers decorating the small church and the entire community in attendance. As Lydia spoke her vows, her laughter bubbled up from sheer joy, and Killian found himself smiling more genuinely than he had in nearly a decade. That evening, as they stood on the porch of what was now their home, the ranch he'd built with his own hands, Killian pulled his bride close. "Never thought I'd find this again," he admitted, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Spent so many years just surviving, never living." Lydia looked up at him, her eyes bright with unshed tears of happiness. "And now I know better," he said simply. "Found life again in your laugh, in your strength, not just surviving anymore. Living instead," she finished for him, standing on tiptoe to kiss him properly as the setting sun painted the Wyoming sky in brilliant hues of promise. Years later, when their children asked how their stern father had come to marry their lively mother, Killian would smile and tell them simply that he'd been a harsh man focused only on survival, until he'd discovered something far more essential, that true living began with the sound of their mother's laughter.